November 18, 1943, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Harlan Thaddeus Merrick walked through the gathering dusk of the South Side, his work boots clicking against the wet pavement as coal smoke hung thick in the November air. In his inside jacket pocket, pressed against his ribs, sat an envelope containing $238, 3 weeks overtime pay from the Homestead Steel Works, where he ran a drop forge in the munitions section. The money was already spoken for. Winter boots for his boy Ellis, 8 years old and growing out of everything. Back rent to Mr. Kowalski, and if anything remained, maybe a chicken for Thanksgiving. Harlan was 35 years old, a Pennsylvania native with a machinist's steady hands and a quiet man's careful way of moving through the world. He never saw them coming. They emerged from the alley between the shuttered hardware store and Kaminsky's Tavern, two shapes in the industrial twilight, young men with the loose-limbed confidence of those who'd never faced consequences. The first blow caught Harlan in the solar plexus with the expertise of someone who'd learned to hurt people efficiently. He dropped to his knees on the wet sidewalk, gasping, his diaphragm seized, unable to draw breath. The second strike, a work boot to his ribs, came with a crack he heard before he felt, like kindling snapping under pressure. "Come on, old-timer, where's the payroll?" The voice was young, almost cheerful, tinged with bourbon and entitlement. Another kick, another rib giving way. Harlan curled instinctively, trying to protect himself, but there were two of them, and they knew what they were doing. Through the pain and the inability to breathe, he heard their laughter, not cruel exactly, but casual, as though they were doing something no more significant than fishing or playing cards. Strong hands rifled through his jacket, found the envelope, withdrew it with a satisfied sound. "Told you he'd be carrying cash. These munitions boys always get paid on Thursdays. Let's go before someone—" Harlan tried to focus on their faces, but the streetlight was behind them, and the pain in his chest was becoming something more than pain. It was consuming all his attention, all his ability to think. He caught fragments. One taller, broader shoulders, one shorter, quicker movements. Young voices, American accents without the immigrant roughness he heard all day at the plant. Educated voices, almost. Then they were gone, and Harlan Merrick lay in the pool of rainwater and his own blood beside the shut-up hardware store, trying to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Antonina Dombrowski from the boarding house on 18th Street found him 17 minutes later. She'd been walking home from her shift at the laundry and nearly stepped on him in the dark. Her scream brought men running from the tavern, Chester from the loading docks, Big Mickey Brannigan, old Mr. Sorensen. They lifted Harlan carefully, his ragged breathing terrible to hear, and half-carried him the 3 blocks to his tenement on Carson Street. Vera Merrick opened the door to find her husband gray-faced and bleeding, supported by 3 neighbors, and let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. Their son Ellis looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been practicing his multiplication tables. The boy was small for his age, serious-faced, with his father's steady gray eyes. He saw his father's lips blue-tinged, saw the way each breath seemed to tear something inside him, saw the spreading darkness on his shirt. "I'll call for an ambulance," Vera said, already moving toward the hallway where Mrs. Chen had the only telephone.
No.
Harlan's voice was barely a whisper, each word clearly costing him. The officers arrived 50 minutes later. Sergeants Morrison and Kelleher in a black Ford sedan with __quote_6__ stenciled on the door. They came up the narrow stairs, bringing the smell of cigarettes and night air, and stood in the Merrick's small living room while Harlan, lying on the threadbare sofa, explained what had happened. 2 men, young, attacked him, took his pay envelope. Couldn't see their faces clearly. The sergeants exchanged a look that Harlan, even through his pain, recognized. Morrison pulled out a notebook, licked the tip of his pencil. Harlan stopped. He'd recognized one of the voices now that he had time to think, recognized it from Sunday afternoons when the Caldwell boys would roar down Carson Street in their father's Packard, shouting and laughing. Garrett and Wade Caldwell, sons of Captain Roland Caldwell, head of the South Side precinct. The captain lived in Point Breeze now, had made good money somehow during the Depression when everyone else was starving. But his boys still came down to the south side sometimes, slumming. Kelleher prompted. Harlan said quietly. Morrison wrote slowly in his notebook. When he looked up, his expression was neutral, professional. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 12, underscore, underscore. Vera's head snapped up. My husband doesn't drink. Ma'am, we're just trying to establish the facts. Mr. Merrick, how much would you say you'd had? Nothing. I don't drink. I was coming home from work. Morrison nodded, still writing. Well, we've got a witness, fellow from the tavern. Says he saw a man stumbling on the sidewalk around that time. Looked intoxicated. Could have fallen, hit his head. In this blackout weather, with the dim streetlights, easy enough to lose your footing. I was attacked, Harlan said, but his voice had lost its strength. And this pay envelope you mentioned, you sure you had it when you left work? Maybe you stopped somewhere, had a few drinks, lost track of it. War work's stressful. No shame in a man having a belt or two to unwind. Harlan looked at the two policemen and understood. They knew, or they'd been told. Either way, this conversation had already been decided before they'd climbed his stairs. The report would say, drunk worker, accidental fall, no money found. Case closed. Kelleher closed his notebook with a snap. We'll file a report, Mr. Merrick. If anything turns up, we'll let you know. In the meantime, you might want to be more careful. These are dangerous times. Lots of criminal elements taking advantage of the blackout regulations. After they left, Vera stood trembling in the middle of the room. Harlan, they're lying. Everyone knows you don't touch alcohol. We'll go down to the station. We'll file a complaint. No, Harlan said. His breathing was a terrible, wet sound. We won't. But, Vera, please. She looked at her husband, at the defeat in his eyes, and felt something crack inside her chest. But she nodded. She understood, even if she didn't want to. Ellis hadn't moved from the corner where he'd been standing since the police arrived. The 8-year-old boy had absorbed every word, every inflection, every meaningful pause. He understood that his father had been beaten and robbed. He understood that the men who'd done it would face no punishment. He understood that the police, who were supposed to protect people, had instead protected the criminals. And he understood, with a clarity that would shape the rest of his life, that his father was afraid. That night, lying in bed listening to his mother's muffled crying from the kitchen, Ellis Merrick made a decision. He was too young to understand it as a decision, too young to articulate what it meant. But he knew, with the absolute certainty of childhood trauma, that he would never be powerless like his father. Never. The next morning, Harlan tried to stand. The pain in his left side was so intense it grayed out his vision, but he got to his feet. Vera begged him to go to the hospital. Quote 25, quote, he said simply. Quote 26, quote. Quote 27, quote. Quote 28, quote. He went to the plant. The Homestead Steel Works sprawled along the Monongahela River, a cathedral of industry where molten metal flowed like rivers and the air itself seemed to vibrate with heat and noise. Harlan worked the drop forge in Building 7, making shell casings for 75mm rounds. It was precise work requiring constant attention, and every blow of the forge sent vibrations through the floor, through his boots, through his shattered ribs. By lunch break, he was gray-faced and shaking. The foreman, a man named Dutch Vandermeer, pulled him aside. Dutch looked at him for a long moment. Harlan stood through the 8-hour shift. When he got home after dark, he collapsed onto the sofa and couldn't eat the dinner Vera had kept warm for him. Couldn't do anything but lie there, breathing carefully, waiting for the pain to recede enough that he could sleep. Ellis watched his father every evening that week. Watched him drag himself to work before dawn, come home after dark, eat nothing, sleep poorly. The boy said nothing, but he remembered. 3 weeks after the attack, Harlan Merrick began coughing blood. Vera found the stained handkerchief hidden in his work jacket and forced him to see the company doctor at the plant medical office. Dr. Theodore Bannister, a weary man in his 50s who'd seen every injury the steel industry could inflict, listened to Harlan's lungs with a stethoscope, frowned, and ordered an X-ray at Mercy Hospital. The films showed 3 fractured ribs on the left side, one of which had healed incorrectly, and whose jagged edge was now puncturing the pleural lining of his lung. Internal bleeding, risk of infection, required immediate surgery and at least 6 weeks of bed rest. Dr. Bannister said, removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate slowness. Harlan kept his voice level. Dr. Bannister put his glasses back on, looked at Harlan for a long moment. The doctor was quiet for a while. Then he wrote something on a prescription pad, handed it to Harlan. Harlan filled the prescription at Schulman's Pharmacy on East Carson, using money Vera had been saving for Ellis's winter coat. He took the pills as directed, went to work, endured. By Christmas 1943, the pain had receded to a constant dull ache. The rib had finished healing, albeit crookedly, and the puncture wound had sealed over. Harlan even allowed himself to hope that he'd gotten through the worst of it. What he didn't know, what Dr. Bannister had suspected but hadn't said, was that the prolonged internal injury had seeded a chronic inflammation in his left lung. It would smolder there, barely noticeable, slowly destroying the tissue for years to come. Ellis observed everything. He watched his father swallow pills every morning and evening, watched him move carefully, favoring his left side, watched him come home exhausted, defeated, used up by the machinery of industrial labor. And he watched his mother cry quietly in the kitchen late at night when she thought everyone was asleep. In early 1944, on a gray Sunday afternoon in January, Ellis saw them. The Caldwell brothers walking down Carson Street like they owned it, and in a sense, they did. Garrett was the elder at 22, tall and lean with dark hair slicked back and a narrow, handsome face that women noticed. Wade was 20, heavier set, with a red-faced joviality that came from too much drinking and too little consequence. They wore expensive leather jackets despite the fabric rationing, and they walked with the careless swagger of young men who'd never been told no. Ellis stood on the corner by Kaminsky's Tavern and watched them pass. They didn't notice the small, serious-faced boy. Why would they? He was nobody, nothing, beneath their notice. But Ellis noticed them, memorized their faces, their walks, the sound of their laughter, filed it all away in the part of his mind that was already planning, already calculating, even if he couldn't have explained what he was planning for. The winter of 1943 to 44 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a stretch. Coal was rationed, and the Merrick's tenement was never adequately warm. Harlan continued working the drop forge, his cough worsening but not quite bad enough to see a doctor. By spring, he'd lost weight. His face had taken on a gaunt, hollow look, and the gray circles under his eyes had become permanent features. Vera pleaded with him to see Dr. Bannister again. "Harlan, please, you're getting worse." "I'm fine, just tired." "You're not fine, you're dying." "I'm not dying, I'm working." But he was dying, slowly, invisibly. The chronic inflammation in his lung had progressed to early-stage fibrosis. Every breath he took was slightly harder than the last. Every shift at the forge left him more depleted. By 1945, when Germany surrendered and the war in Europe ended, Harlan looked like a man of 50 rather than 37. The war's end brought new anxieties. Munitions production slowed. Layoffs began. Harlan, who'd once been proud of his work, now lived in constant fear of the pink slip he knew was coming. It came in August 1945, just after Japan surrendered. "Reduction in force," the notice said. "Your services are no longer required as of August 24, 1945. Thank you for your contribution to the war effort." Vera read the letter and wept. Harlan sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "I'll find something else." But jobs were scarce. Returning soldiers had priority. Men with better health, better connections, better luck. Harlan found work as a janitor at a paper mill, then as a night watchman, then as a day laborer doing whatever odd jobs he could find. The family slipped from working-class poverty to something more desperate. They moved to a cheaper tenement in Lawrenceville. Vera took a job cleaning offices downtown. Ellis, now 12 years old, worked a paper route before school, contributed his earnings without being asked. The boy had grown quiet, serious, frighteningly focused. He read constantly, not children's books, but thick volumes from the public library about history, law, government. When his 7th-grade teacher, Miss Kowalczyk, asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Ellis answered without hesitation. Quote, 55, quote, 56, quote, 57. Miss Kowalczyk smiled, not understanding the steel in the boy's voice. Well, you'll need to work very hard. Law school is expensive. I'll find a way. And he did. Ellis Merrick became the kind of student that teachers both admired and found slightly unsettling. Perfect grades, perfect attendance, perfect discipline. He had no close friends, participated in no sports, showed no interest in the normal pleasures of adolescence. He worked, he studied, and he watched. In 1949, when Ellis was 14, his father finally collapsed. Not at work this time. There was no work to collapse at. But at home, in the evening, while climbing the stairs to their 3rd-floor apartment. He simply stopped breathing effectively, turned blue, and fell. Vera screamed for help. Neighbors called an ambulance. At Allegheny General Hospital, the doctors diagnosed advanced pulmonary fibrosis, chronic pneumonia, and severe malnutrition. Harlan Merrick was admitted to the charity ward, where he stayed for 2 months while they tried to stabilize his condition. He survived, barely, but emerged from the hospital a broken man. His lungs were permanently damaged, his capacity for physical labor essentially gone. He lived for 2 more years, drifting from one low-paying, undemanding job to another. Ticket collector at a movie theater, night clerk at a flophouse, until pneumonia claimed him in February 1951. He was 43 years old. The death certificate listed pulmonary failure due to chronic inflammation, complications from thoracic trauma, 1943. Ellis was 16 when his father died. He stood at the grave in St. Mary's Cemetery, watching the cheap pine coffin being lowered into the frozen ground, and felt nothing except a cold, terrible clarity. His father had been killed. Not quickly, but slowly, over 8 years, by the injury inflicted that November night in 1943. And the men who'd done it had never faced justice. That would change. 1951 to 1957. Education and preparation. Ellis Merrick finished high school at the top of his class, won a partial scholarship to Duquesne University, and worked 3 jobs to cover the rest. He studied history and political science with a single-minded intensity that worried his mother. He graduated summa cum laude in 1955, immediately enlisted in the United States Army, and applied for the Judge Advocate General's Corps. The JAG recruiter, a captain named Devereaux, interviewed Ellis in a windowless office in downtown Pittsburgh. Devereaux said, reviewing the file. Ellis said. Devereaux studied the young man across from him. There was something off about Ellis Merrick, a coldness, a distance, but his record was impeccable. Ellis spent 2 years as a JAG officer, first in Virginia, then in West Germany, dealing with court-martials, military tribunals, and the administrative machinery of military justice. He was efficient, thorough, utterly without mercy. Fellow officers found him brilliant but unnerving. He made no friends, had no romantic relationships, lived entirely for his work. In 1957, having completed his service obligation, Lieutenant Ellis Merrick separated from active duty and enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He was 22 years old and had a plan that had been forming for over a decade. He would finish law school, pass the bar, and then he would hunt. 1957 to 1963, law school and investigation. Pitt law suited Ellis perfectly. The rigorous case method, the adversarial structure, the emphasis on precedent and procedure. It all made sense to him in a way that human relationships never had. He excelled in criminal law, evidence, and constitutional procedure. His professors noticed his particular intensity when discussing prosecutorial discretion and the limits of police corruption. In his second year, Professor Harold Weinstein taught a seminar on the American criminal justice system. One evening, after a lecture on police accountability, Ellis stayed behind. Quote 69 Weinstein, a former public defender in Philadelphia, leaned back in his chair. Ellis hesitated. But it wasn't research. In his spare time, what little there was, Ellis had been building a file. He'd started with newspaper archives at the Carnegie Library, searching for any mention of the Caldwell family. Captain Roland Caldwell had retired from the police force in 1946, allegedly on disability, but had somehow purchased a large home in Squirrel Hill and invested in several downtown properties. His son Garrett had attended the University of Pittsburgh for 2 years before dropping out. Wade had never attended college at all. Both had police records: drunk and disorderly, assault, one incident of suspected theft, but all charges had been dropped or reduced. Ellis created a timeline, a chart, a map of connections. He interviewed people who'd lived in the South Side during the war years, posing as a law student writing his thesis. Several mentioned the Caldwell boys, their reputation for trouble, the way their father's position protected them. One elderly woman, Mrs. Dombrowski, the same Antonina who'd found Harlan that night, remembered the incident clearly. "Oh yes, I found him, your father." Poor man. Those Caldwell boys, everyone knew it was them. But nobody could touch them, you understand? The father was captain. Who's going to investigate the captain's sons? "What happened to the brothers?" Ellis asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Garrett, I heard he went into business. Something with government contracts, construction maybe." "Wade." She shook her head. "Wade's got problems with the bottle, dear. Last I heard, he was living in some rooming house in McKee's Rocks, drinking himself to death." Ellis thanked her, took notes, added them to his file. By the time he graduated from law school in 1960, Harlan Merrick had assembled a comprehensive dossier on the Caldwell family. He knew their business interests, their social connections, their vulnerabilities. He knew that Captain Roland Caldwell had died in 1958 of a stroke. He knew that Garrett Caldwell now owned a construction company that held contracts with the Allegheny County government. And he knew that Wade Caldwell was exactly where Mrs. Dombrowski had said, living in a flophouse, working sporadically, drinking constantly. Ellis passed the Pennsylvania bar exam on his first attempt in July 1960. He took a position with the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office as an assistant prosecutor. The starting salary was modest, but that wasn't why he'd taken the job. He'd taken it because he needed access to the system, to the machinery of prosecution, to the relationships and leverage that could make things happen. He was 25 years old. He'd spent 17 years preparing. Now he would act. 1963 to 1965. The Reckoning. Ellis's opportunity came in the spring of 1963. The district attorney, a man named Robert McClelland, had made fighting corruption a centerpiece of his administration. When a federal investigation revealed bid rigging in county construction contracts, McClelland assembled a special prosecutorial team. Ellis volunteered immediately. "I want to be part of this," he told the chief deputy, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Finch. "It's going to be brutal," Margaret warned. "These contractors have connections, money, and very good lawyers. We'll be working 100-hour weeks, and most of the cases will probably plead out or get dismissed." "Why the enthusiasm?" "Because someone needs to do it." Margaret studied him. She'd noticed Harlan Merrick over the past 3 years. Brilliant, hard-working, utterly humorless. She'd also noticed that he seemed to have no life outside work. No girlfriend, no hobbies, no apparent interest in anything except prosecuting cases. But he got results. And for this investigation, they needed people who got results. "All right, you're in." Ellis worked the construction contract cases with the focused intensity that had defined his entire adult life. He reviewed thousands of pages of documents, interviewed dozens of witnesses, traced financial connections through layers of shell companies and false invoices. And in the process, he found what he'd been looking for. Caldwell Construction had received 3 county contracts in 1961 and 1962 through fraudulent bidding practices. The evidence was solid: falsified documents, kickbacks to county officials, deliberate underbidding followed by cost overruns. Ellis built the case against Garrett Caldwell personally. He worked late every night, came in early every morning, pursued every lead with relentless determination. Margaret noticed. Quote, 83, quote, 84, quote, he said simply. But it wasn't justice. It was revenge. And in February 1964, Harlan Merrick got his chance. The grand jury returned indictments against 12 contractors and 5 county officials. Garrett Caldwell was charged with wire fraud, bribery of public officials, and racketeering. The maximum sentence was 20 years in federal prison. Garrett's attorney tried to negotiate a plea. Ellis refused to participate in the discussions. When Margaret asked why, he said, quote, 85. They did. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Ellis assisted on witness preparation, jury selection, and cross-examination strategy. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts, he felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not joy, just a cold sense of completion. Judge Harrington sentenced Garrett Caldwell to 15 years in federal prison. But Ellis wasn't finished. He still had Wade. Finding grounds to prosecute Wade Caldwell was more difficult. The man was a pathetic drunk living on disability checks and odd jobs. But Ellis was patient, and Ellis was thorough. He discovered that Wade had been involved in a series of small-time scams, passing bad checks, petty theft, one incident of assault that had been dropped due to witness intimidation. Ellis built a case file, brought it to Margaret. I want to prosecute. She looked at the documents, then at him. Ellis, this is small potatoes. We've got major cases pending. Why waste time on a washed-up drunk? Because he's a criminal who's never faced consequences. We don't have the resources. I'll do it on my own time. Margaret sighed. She'd known Ellis long enough to recognize that tone. He wouldn't let this go. Fine, but if it interferes with your caseload, I'm pulling you off. It didn't interfere. Ellis prosecuted Wade Caldwell for passing fraudulent checks and assault with intent to commit bodily harm. Charges related to an incident where Wade had beaten a man during an argument over a bar tab. The evidence was marginal, the witnesses reluctant, but Ellis pressed forward with the same relentless focus he brought to everything. Wade's public defender tried to argue diminished capacity due to alcoholism. Ellis countered with Wade's prior record, his pattern of violence, his complete lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a guilty verdict. Judge Morrison sentenced Wade Caldwell to 5 years in state prison. Ellis stood in the courtroom as the sentence was read and felt something he hadn't expected. Emptiness. He'd won. Both Caldwell brothers were in prison. Justice, or something he'd told himself was justice, had been served. But there was no triumph, no relief. Just a vast, echoing hollow where his purpose had been. 1965 to 1980, the void. For the next 15 years, Harlan Merrick threw himself into his work with even greater intensity. He rose through the ranks of the district attorney's office, became known as one of the best prosecutors in western Pennsylvania. He won difficult cases, put away dangerous criminals, built an impressive record. And he was completely, profoundly alone. He had colleagues but no friends. He attended office social events but left early, made small talk but never revealed anything personal. Women occasionally expressed interest. Ellis was not unattractive, and his intensity could be mistaken for depth. But nothing ever developed. He was polite, distant, impenetrable. Margaret Finch, who'd become a close colleague over the years, tried to reach him once. They were working late on a case, and she asked directly, Ellis, what drives you? I've known you for over a decade, and I don't think I know anything about you except that you're the best prosecutor I've ever seen, and the loneliest man I've ever met. What happened to you?" Ellis looked at her for a long moment, almost told her, almost explained about his father, about that November night in 1943, about the revenge that had consumed his entire adult life. But in the end, he just said, "Nothing happened. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're brilliant, but you're hollow. There's nothing in you except the work. The work is enough." But it wasn't. Ellis knew it wasn't. He'd won his revenge, but the victory had left him with nothing. His father was still dead. His mother, Vera, had died in 1972, never understanding why her son had become so cold, so driven. The Caldwell brothers were in prison. Garrett would serve 12 years. Wade would serve 3 before dying of liver failure. But their punishment hadn't healed anything. It had just confirmed what Ellis had suspected all along. Revenge doesn't repair the past. It just extends the damage into the present. In 1978, Ellis took early retirement from the DA's office. He was 43 years old, financially secure from years of frugal living, and completely adrift. He moved into a small apartment in Shadyside, lived off his savings, and did nothing. For months, he simply existed, reading, walking, sleeping, waking, repeating. He'd spent his entire life in pursuit of a goal, and now that the goal was achieved, he had no idea who he was or what he was supposed to do. The emptiness was worse than the pain had been. At least pain had direction, purpose. This was just nothing. 1980, a second chance. In the spring of 1980, Ellis received a phone call from a woman named Olga Brennan. She was organizing a series of community education classes at the Homewood Brushton YMCA and wondered if he'd be interested in teaching an evening course on citizens' legal rights. Ellis asked. Margaret, still looking out for him even after he'd left the office. Ellis almost declined, but something, maybe just the desperation of his current emptiness, made him say yes. The class met Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a drafty basement room. 15 students showed up for the first session. Working-class folks, mostly Black and Latino, who'd had run-ins with landlords, employers, police, the system. They wanted to understand their rights, how to navigate bureaucracy, how to fight back against injustice without lawyers they couldn't afford. Ellis taught them. He explained contracts, tenant rights, employment law, criminal procedure. He was clear, thorough, and to his surprise, he was good at it. The students responded to his no-nonsense approach, his obvious expertise, his willingness to answer any question no matter how basic. After the third session, a young woman named Consuela Martinez stayed behind. "Mr. Merrick, I just wanted to thank you. My landlord's been trying to evict me illegally, and what you taught us about tenant protections, I confronted him with that information, and he backed down. You probably saved my home." Ellis looked at her, saw genuine gratitude in her eyes, felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not the cold satisfaction of winning a case, but something warmer. Something almost like purpose. "I'm glad it helped," he said. Over the following months, more students came to him with problems. He advised them, helped them draft letters, explained their options. He didn't charge them anything. He didn't need the money, and more importantly, he'd realized something. This work, helping ordinary people navigate systems designed to crush them, meant something in a way that prosecuting criminals never had. One evening after class, Olga Brennan approached him. She was a social worker in her late 40s, a widow who'd raised 2 children alone and still managed to maintain a sense of humor about life. She invited Ellis for coffee. "Just to talk," she said. "You've been teaching these classes for 6 months now, and you never stay for the social hour. I'm beginning to think you're antisocial." "I am antisocial," Ellis said. "Well, that's honest. Coffee anyway?" They went to a diner on Penn Avenue. Talked for 2 hours. Olga was easy to talk to. She asked questions but didn't pry, shared stories from her own life without demanding reciprocation. Ellis found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Over the next year, they became friends. Then, tentatively, something more. Ellis was 45, Olga was 48, and neither of them expected romance at this stage of life. But it happened anyway, slowly, carefully, two damaged people finding unexpected comfort in each other. One night, lying in Olga's bed in her small house in Homewood, Ellis told her everything. About his father, about the attack, about the years of planning and revenge, about the emptiness after. He spoke for almost 2 hours while Olga listened, holding his hand. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, quote, 6. Ellis closed his eyes, felt something in his chest, the old wound from 1943, the one that had never healed, finally begin to close. Not completely. It would never close completely, but enough that he could breathe. Quote, he said. Quote, Olga said, and kissed him. 1980 to 2008. Redemption and Purpose. Ellis and Olga married in 1982, a small ceremony with just a few friends. He continued teaching community legal education classes, expanded to other neighborhoods, eventually started a small nonprofit organization called Pittsburgh Legal Literacy that trained community members to understand and assert their rights. The work was unglamorous and poorly paid, but it mattered. Students from his classes went on to organize tenant unions, fight employment discrimination, challenge police misconduct. Ellis watched them succeed and felt a pride he'd never experienced as a prosecutor. This was creation, not destruction. This was building something rather than tearing down. In 1995, a young man named Terrence Wallace came to one of his classes. Terrence was 22, had grown up in the Hill District, and wanted to become a lawyer to help his community. He was smart, angry in the way young people are when they first see injustice clearly, and reminded Ellis painfully of himself at that age. After class one evening, Terrence asked, "Mr. Merrick, can I ask you something personal? Why do you do this? You were a big-shot prosecutor. You could be making serious money in private practice. Why teach free classes in church basements?" Ellis considered the question. How much to tell? In the end, he said simply, "Because revenge doesn't fix anything. But helping people, actually helping them, giving them tools to help themselves, that does fix things. Small things, maybe, but real things." Terrence nodded slowly. "You sound like you learned that the hard way." "I did." Years passed. Ellis and Olga grew older together, found contentment in small things. Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, conversations that didn't require explanations. Ellis's health remained decent, though the years of stress had taken their toll. In 2006, he had a mild heart attack, spent a week in the hospital, emerged with a new appreciation for his remaining time. In 2007, Ellis received a letter. It had been forwarded through several addresses before finding him. The return address was Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Inside was a single page, handwritten in careful block letters. "Mr. Merrick, I don't expect you to read this, or if you do, to care. But I wanted to say it anyway. I know you were the prosecutor who put my case together. I know why you did it. My father told me once, years ago, about a man we beat up and robbed during the war. Said it was just boys being boys, nothing serious. I didn't think about it again until I was sitting in prison, facing 15 years, and I started adding up all the things I'd done without consequences, all the people I'd hurt because I could. Your father, Harlan Merrick, I looked him up, died in 1951, from complications of injuries sustained in an assault in 1943. That was us. Wade and me. And you spent your whole life making us pay for it. I don't blame you. I deserve to be here. Wade's dead now. Liver gave out in '68. I got out in '76, tried to go straight, fell back into old patterns, ended up back here in '85 on different charges. I'll probably die in prison, and that's fair. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. For what we did to your father. For every choice I made that hurt people. I can't fix it. I can't even ask for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that at least one person understands what you did, and why. Garrett Caldwell Ellis read the letter 3 times, showed it to Olga. Quote, 113, quote, she asked. Quote, 114, quote. Quote, 115, quote. Quote, 116, quote. He folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and never read it again. The revenge was over, had been over for decades. This letter changed nothing, except perhaps to confirm that it had all been meaningless. The pursuit, the victory, the years of emptiness. Garrett Caldwell's apology was sincere. Ellis believed that. But sincerity didn't resurrect the dead or restore the time wasted on hatred. 2008 to 2018, final years. Ellis retired from active teaching in 2010 at age 75, though he continued to volunteer occasionally. His health declined gradually. The heart condition, arthritis, the slow erosion of age. Olga, 10 years younger, cared for him with the same steady competence she brought to everything. In 2015, Ellis suffered a stroke. Moderate severity, some speech impairment, reduced mobility on his right side. He recovered enough to function but never fully regained his previous sharpness. He spent his days reading, listening to music, sitting on the porch of their small house in Point Breeze watching the world go by. One afternoon, a former student named Terrence Wallace, now a successful civil rights attorney, came to visit. They sat on the porch, drinking iced tea, talking about cases and life. Terrence said. Ellis said slowly, the words coming with effort. Quote, 120. Quote, 121. Quote, 122. Ellis was quiet for a long time, marshaling his thoughts through the fog of post-stroke aphasia. Finally, he said, quote, 1, 2, 3. Terrence nodded. Quote, 1, 2, 4. After Terrence left, Ellis sat on the porch until dark. Thought about his father, Harlan Thaddeus Merrick, dead at 43, killed by broken ribs and a broken system. Thought about his mother, Vera, who'd loved them both and understood neither. Thought about the Caldwell brothers, one dead of drink, one dying in prison. Thought about the decades he'd lost to hatred. And thought about Olga, inside the house right now making dinner. Thought about the students he'd taught, the lives he'd maybe changed. Thought about Terrence, using the law to fight for people who needed it. Maybe it balanced out. Maybe not. But it was something. Epilogue, 2020. Ellis Merrick died on March 15, 2020, at age 85. The obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called him quote, _125 __. It mentioned his work with Pittsburgh legal literacy, his decades of volunteer teaching, his survivors, including his wife, Olga. It didn't mention the beating on Carson Street in 1943, didn't mention the Caldwell brothers or the revenge that consumed 40 years, didn't mention the emptiness or the late-found redemption. But those stories existed anyway. Olga knew them. Some of Ellis's students knew fragments. And Ellis himself had written it all down in careful longhand during the quarantine months before his death. A memoir of sorts. He called it quote, _126 __, and left instructions for Olga to donate it to the University of Pittsburgh archives after his death. It sits there now, in a box labeled quote, _127 __. Occasionally, a law student researching something else stumbles across it, reads the story of a man who spent his life pursuing revenge, achieved it, found it hollow, and spent his final decades trying to atone through service. There are no easy lessons, no moral that ties everything together neatly. Just the story of one man's pain and what he did with it. Some good, some bad, most of it complicated. The file ends with a single paragraph, written in shaky handwriting dated February 2020. I don't know if I was right or wrong. I don't know if my father would be proud or ashamed. I know I hurt people in pursuit of what I called justice. I know I helped people when I finally learned to stop hurting them. I know that revenge is easy and forgiveness is hard, and living with yourself is hardest of all. I know I tried. That's all anyone can do. Try. And hope that trying matters. Students read those words and think about justice, revenge, forgiveness, and the weight of old wounds. They think about systems that fail people, about the price of silence, about the cost of speaking up. There are no answers, just questions, and the hope that asking them means something. The story of Harlan Merrick is one story among millions. But it matters, because it reminds us that evil creates evil, that revenge perpetuates pain, that breaking the cycle requires sacrifice. Harlan Merrick was killed by silence and injustice. Harlan Merrick nearly killed himself with revenge. But in the end, he found a kind of salvation. Imperfect, late, insufficient, but real, in helping others find the justice he'd never quite found for himself. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can hope for. To recognize our wounds, to resist letting them define us completely, to find some way, however small, however late, to turn pain into purpose. The law isn't always just. Justice isn't always legal. But humanity, compassion, memory, these things transcend both law and justice. These things make life bearable. Ellis learned that. Too late to save his youth, his relationship with his mother, his chance at an ordinary happiness. But not too late to matter. Not too late to help others. Not too late to show that redemption, even partial redemption, is possible. That's the lesson, if there is one. That we all get choices, and we all live with the consequences. And we all deserve a second chance, even when we don't think we do. Ellis got his second chance at 45. Some people never get one at all. He took it, and that made all the difference.